And we're live on YouTube.
So welcome back, everybody, for the last session this evening, which still has to manage some technical problems, which might is due to what we are going to talk about, which is reproduction and the material world, architecture and industrial design. What we are going to do is to have a look at the material world, because as a historians, we are quite used to ignore the material world and material sources. We are very much used to use textual evidence of discourses only, and to overlook that living always takes place in a material world and always took place in a material world. So we will have to consider the material world, of course, also regarding reproduction and the family life, sexuality, and so on, what we are discussing here. So first of all, we have two papers to be presented, hopefully. And the first one is by Aleksandra Jakóbczyk-Gola, who might is the perfect presenter for this topic, as she's at the same time at the University of Warsaw, and she's curator at the Polish History Museum. So she's used to tell histories by material sources, by objects which are displayed in the museum. So Aleksandra, the screen is yours. Go for it.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm not sure if I'm well heard. Is it okay? So give me just a side if it's okay. Okay, thank you. So I would like to share the screen, okay, this is my presentation. Okay. So I would like to focus on the problem of architecture of sexuality and the customs of Polish nobility and its influence on architecture during the early modern period. So this is my subject of my presentation, and I would like to focus on the problem of marriage and sexual life in old Polish tradition. Sensuality in the Polish Commonwealth was a concept which developed in a state of tension and internal conflict. Christian techniques exhorted purity, abstinence, and the denial of earthly desires. Such an approach was not just commended in church teaching and sermons, but was also presented in lay literature, the aim of which was the formation of specific ethical stances. An opposing force was the expressive displays of emotion and dynamism. The concept of love in the cultural world of early modern Poland was multifaceted. The Italian ideal of love, which was introduced through poetry and references to the rhetoric of Petrarch, was based on excessive displays of admiration for the other sex. This approach did not take hold in the culture of early modern Poland. The very word miłość, literally meaning the love, was understood mostly in terms of a sensual experience. The Polish dictionary of Bogumił Linde, written in the early 19th century, recommends describing other desires as forms of love. For example, the love of money to emphasize their desire nature. There was widespread argument that love could take a negative, condemnable shape and could lead to the rejection of social norms. According to Sebastian Klonowicz, a Polish Renaissance poet, love is connected to desire and shameless frenzy, which changes into lust and can lead to madness. Early modern Polish culture was filled with impulses, conversations, and the jokes at the time tended to be much less restrained than they would be in later centuries, and often involve sexual times. Okay. It's possible that the more upfront approach of sexuality was partly influenced by the dietary customs of Polish nobility in the early modern period. Excessive consumption of animal protein and the large number of calories consumed every day likely lead to an increase of the sexual drive. The more open attitude towards physical pleasure was also aided by alcohol, which was consumed with little restraint. Drunkenness was a particular masculine vice and often used to embolden men to their contacts with women. Boredom was yet another reason for engaging in the pleasures of the flesh. The life of the landed nobility followed a repetitive routine. Many journals and diaries from the time emphasize the monotony of life in the country and the limited, sometimes completely lack of entertainment. It is also worth remembering that in the early modern period, people lived under constant threat of death, be it from natural causes, war, disease, and natural calamities. Sexuality provided a way of escaping the everyday fear connected with death. Because death seemed so inevitable, engaging in marriage was also often rushed. Erotic life in the early modern period was characterized by passion, but sometimes even brutality. Another reason was the fear of loneliness, so unaccepted. Marriages tended to last only 10 to 15 years. The reason for this were the dangers already listed above, but also because of the high level of mortality at childbirth. After a spouse died, a new marriage tended to be arranged relatively quickly, sometimes within months, and often would be based on personal choice, in contrast to first marriages, which were usually arranged by the parents of the couple. On the most significant reason for early marriage was the conception of progenitor, that is, of extending one's bloodline. Wives were expected to be fertile. They were supposed to give birth to sons who would then continue the works of their ancestors. Daughters were not considered desirable because they joined other families and had to be provided with dowry. Marriage, therefore, constitute the solution to numerous issues connected to sex and sexuality. Marriage concealed the teachings and laws of religion with human nature and the sexual drive, which was never fully satisfied. Contemporary norms designate the home as the only place for people through loyalty, friendship, or deeper romantic feelings. It is also unified the couple in a physical sense. In the life of a family, sex and marriage were not kept apart. Sexual activity was the source of pleasure and a way of satisfying desires, and which later allowed for the realization of other goals and aspirations. Sex was also considered a cure for many different kinds of illness, especially in virtue of the medical teaching of the time, which were based on the idea of the balance of the humors. Sexual intercourse was believed to help calm various phlegmatic or melancholic maladies. Like all medication, it was supposed to be used responsibly and without excess, at the right time and in specific health conditions. Otherwise, intercourse could be harmful, could lead to an imbalance of the humors. A long rest after intercourse was also recommended, especially for women. It was believed that sex would lead to conception only if it was pleasurable and full of passion. The family model in early modern Poland was different from the model propagated in 19th century, and which now is often referred to as being a traditional. In the early modern period, the husband was not necessarily the only source of income of the family, and the role of the wife was not limited only to households. We have numerous examples of noble women who managed landed estates and had their own servants. This was not in contrary to the wishes of their husbands, but rather with their full approval. To the energy and economic talents of their wives, noble men could engage in what they duties, war and politics. Young noble women were married off in order to provide a livelihood, their own decision about who they would marry rather than leaving the matter to their parents. The betrothal period would typically be rather short, sometimes limited to just a few weeks, if the couple was well matched in terms of social and financial status. Women were eager for the independence granted by the marriage. The betrothal period later began to expand, and in 18th and 19th century, it was uncommon for it to last for even years. The unique trait in the culture of early modern Poland was the widowed women. They had the most independence. They were also free to choose the next candidate for marriage, and no one could force them into a choice they did not wish. Despite the fact that there was more balance between the sexes in early modern Poland, social expectations for men and women were different. Noble men were allowed to maintain sexual relations outside of marriage, as long as this would not harm family relations. Women, on the other hand, were expected to be chaste and modest. Mothers did not teach their daughters anything about sex and the duties of marriage that they would come to face women would enter marriage ignorant of their own sexuality and the pleasures and the dangers. But the backdrop for the noble family in the Polish Commonwealth was the manor house, norms which outlined the roles of men and women and their relations between each other. The manor was usually a one-story building with a pitched roof. Architectural theory shows that in the later half of the 17th century, there was a clear shift in the style of the architecture of the dwellings of the nobility. An example of this shift can be seen in a short treatise on the building of manors, palaces, and castles according to the heavens and the Polish customs. This is Polish krótka nauka budownicza dworów, pałaców, zamków podług nieba i zwyczaju polskiego. An anonymous treatise, which was published in 1659, and which is considered to be the earliest normative text on architecture written in Poland. the civil architecture, because we have some area about the war architecture. The treaties discuss the specifics of various rooms and the gradation of space within the house. The interior of the manor was divided into the official part, which was a large hall, and the representative dining room, which was the heart of every home in early modern Poland. The intimate sphere of the house was composed of specialist rooms and apartments belonging to the lord and lady of the house. Their special location was supposed to help prevent non-marital sexual relations. The short treatise on architecture, which I list above, as well as the appendix from the Economica, an economic guide written by Jakóbczyk-Gola in 1679, discuss separate apartments for the different sexes. These were composed on 3 or 4 connected rooms. First was the antechamber, which was a semi-formal room for the reception of guests. Next was the main room, where social life would mostly take place. Last was the bedroom. It's called retirata, which was a private room for resting during the day. The day rooms of the lady of the house were located near her husband's. The reason for this was according to a number of treaties to limit the danger of infidelity. It was more acceptable for men to engage in extramarital affairs, while women were expected to remain true and chaste. This, notwithstanding a wife infidelity, was not followed by dire consequences as it was in most of Europe. On the other hand, men who had been cheated by their wives were subjected to widespread ridicule and tended to be the butt of many jokes and humorous poems. Despite the relatively relaxed attitude towards husbands' infidelities, a married couple's love life was considered very important. In early modern Poland, it was usually for the husband and wife to share a bedroom, something very unusual in most of Western Europe. The married couple's bedroom would be decorated either using romantic symbolism or with depiction of naked couples in erotic moments. The devaluation of the marriage began to take place in the 18th century. The husband and the wife became almost strangers, and marriages became focused on material and social gain. It was made evident in the architecture as the bedrooms of the husband and wife were kept separated in this period, usually located well away from each other. This allowed the husband and wife to pursue their own individual lives, sometimes even love lives. Intimacy and sexual relations were not considered an important aspect of marriage during the Enlightenment. Okay, 5 minutes. In some cases, especially in the houses of the royalty and the upper aristocracy, the living apartment included additional, fashionable at the time, rooms. These were usually located in the corner section of the buildings. This meant that the plan of the manor house changed. The chambers, which were located out of reach of guests of the house, were all under women control. Some of these chambers were highly elegant and stylish. The sitting rooms and children's rooms were associated only with women, as in the more early modern period, the upbringing of children was considered the domain of women. Similarly, music was considered a feminine activity. Rooms which were intended to be the location of family concerts were small and tended to be decorated in musical motifs. In early modern Poland, women were the ones who sang or played instruments and would meet in music rooms to play music together, while the husbands, brothers, and the rest of the family and guests could come to listen. The architectural plan of the manor also allowed sole entry to the Frauzimmer, from the German Frauenzimmer, from the suites belonging to the lady of the house. The women's court was divided hierarchically into the upper and lower Frauzimmer. The upper Frauzimmer was the place for the guests of honor and the closest female companions of the lady of the house. In the lower Frauzimmer were the lady who served the upper class ladies and the lady of the house. Another very fashionable set of rooms, this time only associated with men, were cabinets. These were intended as places where a man could pursue his passions: study, reading, letter writing, and collecting of art, weapons, or any natural artifacts. These were the first museums in early modern Poland. The intimate life of people of early modern Poland was shaped by biology and constrained by the social and cultural norms of the time. Marriage was considered a social duty amongst the nobility and was often connected to material concerns. Architectural theory from this period aimed to express the social norms connected to marriage and procreation in the shape and style of the Polish manor house. The treatise outlined how to construct a home which was both comfortable and in accordance with contemporary social norms. The treatises were written and read by men. It was men who were tasked with the creation of the proper topography of sexual and erotic encounters within the family. Men's role in the shaping and maintaining such norms were therefore much more dominant. Architecture became a tool, maintained the performance of traditions and customs of early modern Poland. The greatest expression of these traditions was the communality of the married couple's bedchamber. As was pointed out by Jan Mrowiński in his treatise Stadło małżeńskie, something like a marriage community. This treatise was written in 1561. So I only read this citation and this is all. Joint body, joint will, joint agreement, joint constant, joint concerns and sadness, joint happiness, joint and equal freedom, common laws, common gains, common riches, and poverty, equal dignity, and a commonality of all issues, works, and dangers. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Aleksandra, for this presentation given by difficult material circumstances by talking on materiality. And now we're going over and we're going to pass several centuries when switching to Yulia Karpova. Yulia just had been changing from the Central European University in Budapest to Copenhagen, and so this is the topographically most northern point of this conference. She's a postdoctoral researcher, and she most of all is researching the history of 20th century Soviet and European art and design. And she just had published a book very much on the topic she will be talking about, comradely objects, design, and material culture on Soviet Russia in the 1960s to 80s, which had been published in English at Manchester University Press. And there are several other publications on visions and visualization and communist visual cultures in the last years. So, Yulia, take the screen and the microphone. The floor is yours. Would you turn on your microphone, Yulia? We cannot hear you.
My apologies, I shared the screen before I muted myself, so now I am sharing it again. So thank you so much, Fritz, for introducing me. And I should like to add that I started my career also in a northern point in St. Petersburg, where I started as an art historian. So my disciplinary trajectory is quite diverse or non-linear. I started as an art historian focused on decorative arts and design, and then I worked as a historian, and then I started framing myself increasingly as design historian. As you know, design history is a discipline with its own organization and journal, but since recently, probably for a bit over a year, I am interested also in the history of medicine and medical design. So what I'm showing today is a new project which I hope to start, but 2020 broke my plans, as it happened to many of you or many scholars worldwide. So I'm going to show the project just at its very point of beginning. Also, I would like to note that my main research now is in a different field, in the history of exhibition exchange during the Cold War. So what I'm presenting here is something I hope to progress with in the future after completing the current research. So I'm trying to sit on two chairs as design historian as such, and as a historian of medicine and medical design. So the project that I hope to start is on the aesthetics that united complex designed environments of modern reproductive healthcare. This is a project in feminist history of art and design, informed by science and technology studies, new materialism and material feminisms. It considers women as users of environments designed for performing biopolitics and as actors of design processes. By designed environment, I mean, following the definition offered by John Rothschild, architecture, urban planning, and product, industrial, and graphic design. By reproductive healthcare, I mean health services directed at maintaining reproductive and sexual well-being of citizens, the well-being as defined by medical experts. These services include gynecological examination, prenatal care, obstetric aid, and maternity care, and from the 70s, 80s, increasingly assisted reproductive technologies, ART. Finally, I use biopolitics in the sense of a set of diverse practices and policies executed by the state and state-sponsored experts for managing lives and reproduction of the population. My research question is how different experts work together in embodying biopolitics in design and expressing it through images, and how the resulting designed environments impacted women's lives over the long period from the 20s to now I can say the 2010s. I planned originally to finish with the 90s. It really depends on how much time I would have for the project, but many interesting things happened in the very recent times, so I would be happy also to include this. And of course, it's much easier to do oral history of the recent decades. Design for reproductive health care has been rarely addressed by design historians, even though it is a promising subject for better understanding of the 20th century social and political role of aesthetically expressive materiality. This project is the first step towards a comparative study of design for reproductive health care in Europe and the USSR and Russia. The geographical choice at this stage focuses on Soviet Russia, Soviet and post-Soviet Russia, and Denmark due to both countries' active involvement in international trends for modernizing architecture and design and healthcare. I'm conscious of the asymmetry of this choice, but nonetheless, I suggest that such comparison can elucidate the particular trajectories of the aesthetics of biopolitics under state socialism on the one hand and under Nordic social democracy on the other. The chronological span of my project is framed by historical turning points. In the 1920s, state-sponsored prenatalism unfolded across Europe in response to the population losses in the Great War, at the same time as the new discoveries in endocrinology fascinated medical communities across borders and informed their views on sexual health and gender norms that were in different ways translated in biopolitics, and thus, I presume, into architecture and design policies, technological and stylistic innovations. The end of my research, the 2010s, is marked by the flourishing of fertility treatment and ART in both countries that has revolutionized biopolitics, and I argue significantly expanded its aesthetics. The events that happened between these two chronological points, the strengthening of state prenatalism in the 20s, World War II, and the subsequent baby boom coexisting with the neo-Malthusian approach to demographics, the second wave of feminism and the invention of contraceptive pill affected the two countries quite differently. The impact of eugenics on medical practices and state policies and the legislation on abortion too took distinct paths in Soviet Russia and Denmark and other Nordic states. This all resulted in distinct aesthetics of biopolitics in the two countries, which were, however, related through pan-European and global trends in science, technology, and design. My project aims to trace these distinct yet related trajectories and look for possible influences and interactions between Soviet and Danish designers for reproductive health care. To date, this subject has not been systematically explored. The only instance known to me is an article by a team of architectural historians on the Research Institute of Maternity and Infancy in Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, built in 1936 as a part of the medical neighborhood, one of the monuments of Soviet constructivist architecture. The authors of the article describe this institute as a manifestation of the Soviet vision of medicalized childbirth as adequate to socialist modernity. From the place for secret birth for unmarried women in the 18th and 19th centuries Russian Empire, a maternity home evolved into a modern space for all Soviet women. Relying on archival materials and interviews with former staff members of the institute, the authors discuss rational architectural plan of the building that reflects the current ideas of hygiene. They argue that the building of the Research Institute of Maternity and Infancy quote is the embodiment of the industrialization strategy in the design of the medical space, end of quote. The article, however, does not give details on the historically changing interiors and medical tools of the institute and their impact on the experience of the patients. Already the Research Institute of Obstetrics and Gynecology, updated from the 19th century institution and moved to a new building in 1904 in St. Petersburg, was presented by its directorship as a modern facility with progressive organization of internal spaces, also in tune with the current ideas of hygiene. I haven't yet discovered any texts similarly analyzing the design of Danish gynecological or birth facilities. There are several works on the history of both Danish and Russian Soviet reproductive and sexual health care, and broader literature on gender policies and relations in these countries. This literature provides the important background for my research. Additionally, brief examples of design for reproductive health care can be found in books on art and design history, which is probably even more interesting finding. And I focus on 2 examples. First, looking through the album 101 Icons of Danish Design, published in 2016 by Design Museum Denmark, I was surprised to find a mid-19th century obstetrician forceps on one of its first pages. It is quite remarkable that the editor, leading Danish design historian Lars Dybdahl, selected this object as a design icon alongside Arne Jacobsen's chairs and Georg Boyensen's silverware. Georg Jensen's silverware. Dybdahl explains that the forceps were among the first domestically designed Danish surgical instruments. Their designer, Camillus Nieuwhoop, was educated as a turner and blacksmith, and from the 1830s traveled to Berlin, Vienna, and Paris for learning from leading makers of surgical instruments. Upon his return to Copenhagen in 1848, he was invited by the provost of the Royal Surgical Academy to study the disciplines of anatomy and surgery there. After graduating, he was appointed as the official instrument designer at the Academy. Nieuwhoop's career flourished. He cooperated with leading surgeons on designing instruments for the surgeries on wounded and disabled soldiers. One of the surgeons eager to cooperate with Nieuwhoop was Carl Edward Marius Levy, a professor of obstetrics department. Levy envisioned a new model of safe obstetric forceps, and Nieuwhoop developed it into a design. The 2 branches of this forceps entered the parturient vagina separately to be later assembled around the newborn's head. The rounded shape of the branches is presented in this album as anatomically adjusted for this purpose. The forceps were made of steel, brass, and precious wood, the materials imagined as best suited hygienic standards at the time. Purpose to ensure birth without damage to the mother and the newborn, this design proved popular among obstetricians in Denmark and abroad, especially in France and England. Even though forceps are no longer used in Danish obstetrics, Dybdahl argues Nieuwhoop's functional and ergonomic design deserves its place in the pantheon of Danish design. Thus, obstetrician forceps became a Danish design icon when outside of the context of use, literally outside of the body. Though this object precedes the chronological scope of my research, it provides an example of an object with power, not only organizing medical practice, but offering to literally save human lives and having the great impact on the lived experience of women. Obstetric and gynecological tools can be important agents in the histories of modern design, science, and technology up to the present day. And notably, the forceps used in the Sverdlovsk Research Institute for Maternity and Infancy that I just recently mentioned have demonstrate a quite similar functional shape. They were shown at an exhibition, Birth of a Citizen in the Museum of Yekaterinburg History in 2017. So the second example, another inspiration for my research came from an obscure moment in the biography of Boris Smirnov, a Leningrader who excelled in several areas of design and arts. In the 1930s, he was involved in designing constructivist buildings, but lost his job in 1936 after a colleague's denunciation. Soon, however, Smirnov was invited by the Leningrad Research Institute of Obstetrics and Gynecology, whose building I also showed you earlier, to design special furniture for childbirth assistance. The details on this project remain to be found in Russian state and private archives. The invitation of a male designer to develop furniture for parturient women is as chilling of the Soviet gendered pseudo-egalitarianism as the fact that throughout the Soviet time, all but one directors of this Leningrad Institute were men. I suppose that similar cooperation between male medical and design professionals in modernizing childbirth facilities can be found in Denmark in the interwar period. Celebrated designers could be concerned with furnishing maternity clinics or probably developing special furniture for home births that were still the middle and upper class choice in Denmark in the 1930s. This is not to suggest, however, that Soviet and Danish women were passively subjected to environments designed by men. I intend to find the ways of how women influence the aesthetics of biopolitics as patients and probably also as designers whose names were obscured by their male colleagues. Could women designers have their say in minimizing the pain and discomfort associated with gynecological examination and childbirth? Could patients give feedback as subject advocating respect for their bodies? I presume that visions of gender and maternity inscribed in design environments were often transformed or disrupted by the users, from more extreme examples of illegal abortions and home remedies for contraception to simple avoidance of gynecological examination or ignorance of anti-abortion and pro-maternity propaganda posters. And posters also, for me, constitute part of the design environment and the aesthetics of biopolitics. And my theoretical framework is proposed by feminist critics of art, design, and architecture. Just a second. Yes, I know. I'm just rounding up. Deborah Fausch and Elizabeth Dross discussed the impact of architecture and urban space on bodies through senses other than vision, and the latter theorizes the relationship between bodies and cities as continuous feedback and two-way production, projection, and interjection. In her study of the material work of a fertility clinic, Stine Adrian employs Karen Barat's notion of phenomena, quote unquote, the ontological inseparability of interacting components, to explain the unity of emotions and material components of an IVF procedure. Drawing on these theorizations, I suggest that the aesthetics of biopolitics encompass not only objects of architecture, graphic and industrial design, but also bodies, internal organs, and embryos screened by the ever-improving medical tools. The visual culture of a gynecological office, a maternity or fertility clinic encompasses posters representing approved sexual behavior and healthy maternity, screens revealing the inside of fertile or infertile bodies, and shiny surfaces of hygienic walls and medical tools, and is therefore also a material culture. Juliana Brunner argues that materiality and visuality meet at a surface that acts as a screen. In a reproductive healthcare facility, I suggest the material-visual relations occur as the interplay between surface and depth, outside of and inside the body, whereas the body is at once represented, examined, and categorized. I will end here, but just to explain this slide, the only documentation related to Boris Smirnov's cooperation with the Institute of Gynecology and Obstetrics are these two photographs, and he actually he was interested in surrealist photography, and here he used double exposure, and I am quite confident that these photos were taken during his work on this project, and especially it's interesting to see the contrast between the kind of disappearing and mystical women's body and the very clearly visible materiality of the bathroom equipment. Just to show one example which I want to look at in my research, the Birth Center in Aarhus, one of the first of this kind in Denmark. And just the final note is that one of my inspirations is this album by two American design historians and curators that actually collected a huge variety of different material objects related to the experience of motherhood. So my contribution would also correspond to this initiative, but looking at European and Soviet Russian examples. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yulia, for this impressive talk, and thank you to Aleksandra. As far as I know, Aleksandra is not able to hear us. Is this still right? Obviously, it is, because we had to decide whether she could hear us or we could hear there. And giving a paper, we decided it would be better to hear Aleksandra and not the other way around. So giving questions to Aleksandra, most of all, would be possible by chat, which is of course possible for giving questions to Yulia, which I will translate. As I already had some questions for Aleksandra, which are in the chat, and there's no use if I mention them here loudly, because she cannot hear us, as far as I know. I just have two questions of myself to Yulia. The first one is to hospital design. And I haven't really seen what is special in Soviet hospital design regarding to other hospitals, especially in early 20th century. I'm just coming back from the International Network for the History of Hospitals, which had a huge conference last week, and we had presentations on hospitals from Taiwan to Hawaii, I think, and New Zealand and everywhere in the world. And regarding early 20th century, they very much look alike. There were very much more differences regarding Muslim hospitals in 18th century and Christian hospitals in this time than within hospitals all over the world in the first half of the 20th century. So there is a huge research literature, of course, which is on the one hand, and the other question is directed to the forceps. The forceps already had been developed in late 18th century, and there had been some changes in early 19th century. And the one you showed us very much reminded me to the Brünninghaus forceps of 1802. And especially in the second half of the 19th century, there had only been minor changes to the forceps. So what is the special Danish aspect of this forceps?
So should I respond right away? Yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So thank you very much for questions. I start from the forceps. It's an example. Like I chose them as less as the object for further study because it belongs to an early period, and of course, the author of this catalog or the album of the icons of Danish design didn't assume that they were the very first of this kind, but they had this kind of they presented a specific development, a specific attitude to this type of an object. And of course, that's for me, it was more interesting as a fact of including this object into the selection of the most iconic Danish designs, because when we think about Danish and Scandinavian design, we think about furniture, ceramics. In Denmark, the furniture maybe is the most showcaseable example, and it is very prominent that the forceps of a particular, so this particular interpretation of forceps by a Danish designer was selected among the greatest, and this was more for me as supporting my argument for the importance of design for reproductive healthcare, even that it appears in the very mainstream catalog, directed not at scholars, academics, but to a broad public who are curious to look at the most spectacular objects of Soviet design. Then speaking of the detail and technological evolution of forceps in Danish and in Soviet Russian context, I will need to get to the archives and libraries and look more closely. So I keep in mind that it's, of course, the details and the meaning of innovation and what kind of innovation can be done there matters a lot. Then hospital design, yes. I don't have many examples again, and I showed one example of the turn of the century design of this St. Petersburg Leningrad institution, which of course reflected the neoclassical tendencies of the time. Then the one in Sverdlovsk it was a part of this medical neighborhood, which was a monument of Soviet constructivism, and the Soviet constructivism is this world famous Soviet contribution to modernist architecture. So of course the Soviet architects looked at the European experience, and they looked at the Bauhaus, and they looked at Western functionalist architecture. So of course there were similarities. There was this vision of the functional separation of different zones within the maternity home in accordance with the current hygienic standards. But on the other hand, it was framed within the Soviet policy and the Soviet progressive which had the history of more progressive abortion legislation, but exactly in the 30s it had again this more conservative turn with the Stalinist reproductive or Stalinist biopolitics. So that's also interesting to look at the different timelines, still the predominance of the modernist architecture, but already more conservative approach to reproductive policies and how this all came together. So of course there were pan-European tendencies, but there were or the war tendencies in modernist architecture, including medical architecture, but there were impacts on the decision making among those who commissioned the buildings and those who designed them and those who built them in accordance to the very specific social political climate. So much that I can say at this stage.
Thank you. Just one addition to what you said on the forceps. Of course, you should go to the medical collections. The one I am curating in Erlangen, we have about 40 or 50 forceps, and I just had a seminar with students, 3 or 4 semesters ago, looking at the medical and the social aspects of design. But this is what Joanna Niezhanovska wants to ask, I think. Joanna.
Yes, thank you. First off, thanks for very inspiring speech. High hopes for the project that you now begin. Now, it's not a question really, but more of a comment on the design of gynecological instruments and also furniture in the aseptic era, post-1870s on. I don't have access to Danish literature, but I do have access to the entirety of gynecological journals published in German language from 1850s up till Second World War. By the way, that's the only thing that we have from that time in Szczecin in our collection. For everything else, I would have to go from Szczecin somewhere. So I went through this like page after page after page, and I now try to recall whether I've ever encountered a paper authored by a woman about the design of a gynecological equipment of any sorts. And sorry, I can't. It might be because I have a squirrel-like memory span, but I do think that I can't recall anything like that because there were no female-made designs. Basically, as soon as childbirth became more and more medicalized, the instruments are made not for the comfort or painlessness or, you know, easy experience for women. They are designed for the convenience of the practitioners, of the doctors. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you about instruments from that time designed by women for women. That would be really big deal if you find something like that, especially coming from physicians, because you have to take into consideration that late 19th, early 20th century, in quite a few European countries, women are not allowed to study medicine, so they have zero access to the very profession, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, again, I will. As I said, I'm starting from the 1920s, and this is for me going back chronologically because usually before I focus on the history of late socialist design, so from the 50s, 60s, and this is an excellent comment. And I maybe I'm going to say something disappointing, but I can only hope to see designs by women, and if I find something like this, either in Denmark or in Russia, I would be absolutely happy. And in this, especially when thinking about the Soviet design of gynecological equipment, I take design very broadly, as is now more and more common, or which has been common for a while among design historians. Not only design is something we show in a design museum, something special designed by some prominent people like Smirnov, for example, in the Soviet context, but any material environment. So I don't presume that all this, any gynecological office had designs by some designer, but somebody still had to decide what do we put there, how do we equip it, and it could be a very messy decision. And this is also very interesting. And like the last small point, but important one, there is of course a very negative image of Soviet gynecology, and I wonder if it's in the same in Poland about the socialist Poland's gynecology, which was the narratives of women who experience that are all about pain, torture, embarrassment, and so on and so on. Total disrespect. And now there were some feminist documentaries about it, and they always show very disgusting interior of a gynecological office with terrible chair, with some dirty rags, so completely like this visceral disgust you are supposed to feel when you look at it. But this narrative, powerful as it is, as a historian, I cannot completely subscribe to it that it was total, that women were tortured on purpose because there was this kind of state war against women in some way, or this. So without diminishing the experience of these women, I want to look at the different details and decision makings, and maybe different ways actually that women could have their say about the designs. Maybe I wouldn't find anything, but who knows? So that's my attempt to bit complicate this narrative of so-called punitive Soviet gynecology.
Joanna? You have to unmute, Joanna.
Yeah,
talking.
sorry. Yeah, bummer. So actually, the first time we had a huge scale public debate about who should be in the focal point in terms of comfort and quality in gynecology, and especially in obstetrics in Poland, in early 1990s. That was the first time. The huge Rodzić po ludzku public campaign, the humane birth or birth the right way. And during that campaign, there were tons of testimonies from women sort of coming out for the first time, sharing their traumatic experience of feeling completely dehumanized, objectified, being treated like things and not persons, generation after generation after generation. So as late as early mid 1990s, the first time women actually are speaking and are listened to, because that's also important. People, and also gynecologists, the medical profession, are not only hearing but listening to us.
Thank you. I just short comment about Denmark. Of course, it's interesting for me not only as the location of my current employment and previous employment at some point, but also as a country very much focused on boosting birth rates, and the country with a lot of fertility treatments also offered within the state insurance. There are so many ART offerings. And it comes a bit with a twist that we offer you so many benefits, so you should want more kids, which can be, of course, problematic, because what kind of kids is this Danish kids? But it's a little bit of a different topic.
Okay, thank you. It's quite late, and it's been an amazing first day of our conference. Most of all, conferences are made of two parts. So there are the presentations and the discussions, and there are the coffee breaks. And afterwards, we just now should leave together for having a glass of wine or beer and having a sunny Berlin evening, which I do miss very, very much. So it's completely without sense to have a drink together and a talk at the screen on Zoom. So everyone of the speakers, Yulia and Aleksandra, for the last session, and of the discussants, many, many thanks. I wish you a very nice evening everywhere across the world and Europe, wherever you are. Refresh, and we'll be together here tomorrow morning at 9:30. So differing from what had been given in the first program, the very first paper had to be withdrawn for health reasons. So we have 30 minutes more to have a hopefully nice breakfast, and see you back here tomorrow morning at 9:30 when we will discuss about the role of midwives. Have a nice evening, everyone.